So I will give a full disclosure at the beginning. I have been invited to give a sermon here, but I am actually here to sell a book. I have purely mercenary reasons for doing this. I have written a book on Romans, and you may think that I am just trying to be funny, but I actually believe in reading. Not just because I'm a writer, but because I do believe that reading is becoming is under threat, that we are not good readers anymore. So if you don't read my commentary, and I'm not going to obligate you to that, just try to find a book on Romans written within the last 10 years. Make sure it is a fairly recent book on the subject, because the more recent books are more interesting than the books that were written some time ago. There is a huge interest in this book. There is enormous interest in the most influential letter ever written in the history of the human race. And I would say that is the book of Romans, because it was originally, as you know, a letter. So one of my kindest readers, who is a professor at Duke University in North Carolina and has done his PhD here in London, he has said very kind things about my book, and I need to make you aware of that. And then there is a person in New York, and I am quoting this not just because it is flattering for my book, but also because it is relevant for my topic. That is to say, the subject of sin in Romans. He says, I do not think I ever enjoyed a commentary as much, with so many surprising riches on nearly every page. This person is a pastor in a Presbyterian church in New York. He is pastor of one of the oldest churches in America, actually. Your description of the debasement of language and descent into violence in Romans 3 actually moved me to tears and could have been taken from the daily news. The bracketing of the troublesome opponent in Romans 1, who wants to insist on God's wrath, is brilliant and has the sympathy of this pastor. And I cannot unsee Eve now that you have shown her to me in Romans 7. These are sort of hints of where we're going. So my subject then is sin and diversity in Romans. And there are three main sin exhibits in this book, beginning in Romans 1. And we cannot read all the text in detail here in the interest of time, but you can read it faster off the screen than I can say it, and I will highlight a few things, and I will quote the introduction to the first representation of human plight that you have in Paul's letter. For the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and wickedness of those who by their wickedness oppress the truth. For what can be known about God is plain to them, because God has shown it to them, so they are without excuse. And then 3 times in Romans 1:18-32, Paul says that God gave them up. Therefore God gave them up in the lust of their hearts to impurity, to the degrading of their bodies among themselves. And the reason why God gave them up is because people turned away from God to idolatry. So there is a causal link in this argument that people who become idolaters, they also become immoral, or there is illicit behavior flowing from it. So there is a line of thought that runs through all throughout this passage, from idolatry to illicit behavior, especially illicit sexual behavior. So toward the end of this text, Romans 1:18-32, there is what really amounts to an Oxford dictionary of vice: senseless, shameless, worthless, faithless, heartless, ruthless, disobedience, inexcusable, ungodliness, wickedness, impurity, degrading passions. And you will see that in Greek, I have transliterated the words in Greek that are on the left side of your screen. and you will see that they are all words beginning with A, meaning that the A or the AN at the beginning of the word means that you lack the virtue that that noun or that adjective is meant to convey. And all of this comes at the beginning of this letter, a strongly worded indictment of the state of the world, ostensibly, or the state of some group in the world who are now under a pretty severely worded indictment. So let's pause for a moment, and let's imagine that after the person who has read this text in the Roman house churches, and who did that, by the way, who was the first reader? Who was? Paul is the author of the letter. Paul dictated the letter to an amanuensis, someone, a scribe, and then they put it, wrapped it up, and then somebody carried the letter from Corinth in Greece to Rome. It's a big journey, and then somebody had to read it. Who read it? Because many people in the Roman house churches could not read. The literacy rate in the ancient world, one doesn't know exactly how high it was, but among the low-born people in Rome, many people couldn't read. Somebody had to read it for them. Among the Jewish community in Rome, there was probably a somewhat higher literacy rate. But somebody now has to read the letter. Who did it? The person who carried the letter did it. And the person who carried the letter was a woman. She was Phoebe. She's mentioned in the first verse in the last chapter of Paul's letter, in chapter 16, verse 1. And most scholars agree that she is the courier and she is also the reader. And when she is a reader, she is also an interpreter, because all reading is interpretation. And we heard the text read here, wonderful reading, and just I wish I could hire you who read the text here and we could go on a tour and you would read Romans out loud just like you did here in front of the church today, and you would be also excellent interpreters simply by the way you read the text. After Phoebe has read Romans 1:18 to 32, something surprising happens. It's like you expect her to follow through on what she has just said, like she wants to drive the point home, But the opposite happens. It is like, she has just made a very important point, and then she turns against it. Then the speaker turns against it. Then Paul, who is the author of the letter, he seems to be rebuking what he just said. Listen to this. This is after chapter 1, beginning of chapter 2. Therefore you have no excuse, O virtuous person, you and all who judge others. For in passing judgment on another, you condemn yourself, because you, the judge, are doing the very same things. Do you imagine, O virtuous person, that when you judge those who do such things and yet do them yourself, that you will escape the judgment of God? Do you hear what I hear? Isn't this a little unexpected, that there seems to be a sort of turning against a certain, because that's what we are expected to hear here, that he has done this indictment of presumably the Gentile world, the way things are among the Gentiles, but then he rebukes the person who represents the Gentile world that way, because there is an implicit sort of sense of virtue on the part of the speaker. And here is how we might see this. It doesn't come out quite right here because I took this down from the internet, but it's supposed to be a pivot. There is a pivot point in the text, and the main pivot, the sort of shift and sort of setting of priorities in this letter is, in my view, found in Romans 2:1-3. So the original indictment, some people say that Paul is performing a sting operation. He talks to an audience, and the audience will say, "That's good, that's right, I really agree with that." And then after he has gotten the audience on his side of the argument, and everyone is really fired up, then he starts actually saying, "Well, guess what? I laid a trap for you, because maybe there is a problem out there in the Gentile world." But the attitude of moral superiority, the sort of pomposity and sanctimoniousness implied in the speaker's attitude, is actually an even bigger problem. It is the bigger problem. So here is what we should see then in the first representation of sin in Romans. Romans 1:18-32 features an indictment of presumably Gentile idolatry and promiscuity. Romans 2 begins with a harsh rebuke of the speaker and viewpoint expressed in 1:18-32. If the depravity of 1:18-32 is bad, the sanctimony and pomposity of the speaker is worse. His is the bigger sin. Reality and representation in Romans 1, and I don't think we get this. There is supposed to be, I need to work on these slides. There is supposed to be, you see this is a group of people, and they are supposedly Jews, and there is a group of people here, and they are supposed to be Gentiles. I have them in red. If you turn your head, you will see them better on the screen in the back. Look at it there. You see that? Two similar groups. So it is as though Paul, or the letter to Romans, are addressing two groups, and in the representation in Romans 1, how the Jews see the Gentiles, how we see you. You are really, really bad, and God is angry with you. And that's the indictment in Romans 1. And then the question from the point of view of the Gentiles, is that true, or is that fair? Is it accurate? Is it even wise to talk that way about other people, another group, and in some way stereotype the group and read them as sort of wholesale indictment? So reality and representation in Romans 2, and again, you're supposed to see the group. You need to turn. They are there on the screen in front of me. So here is a sort of turning of tables. The Jew side of it, you are not what you pretend to be. God is angry with you. God is angry with you, with the Jews. You are guilty of idolatry too, and you are a disgrace. In Romans 2:24, God's name is blasphemed among the Gentiles because of you. And then the Gentiles acknowledge in chapter 2, I am bad, but so are you. And in fact, you are worse for thinking that you are better. And then, I am not as bad as you made it seem. That's the sort of Gentile corrective, the sort of balancing of this equation in chapter 2. Now, here is one thing, and this is one reason why one needs to read a book and not just listen to a sermon. It has been argued that this sort of stereotypical perception of the situation in Romans is too simplistic. You cannot do this in group stereotype. This is not Jews on one side and Gentiles on the other side. This is, yes, there might be Gentiles on one side, but the implied speaker in Romans 1:18-32 are not the Jews. They are counter-missionaries who are talking a certain way, and they are putting at risk Paul's Gentile mission. And when Paul rebukes the implied speaker in Romans 1, he is not rebuking the Jews, but he is rebuking the counter-missionaries. That's a possibility. That has been argued, and there is some merit to it, it seems to me. But in order to assess the merit of such claims and such a destabilizing reading of Romans, you will need to read a book or 2 or 3. It cannot be done in sermon form. And you should not just sort of bypass the opportunity to rethink some of these things. So here is the counter-missionary perspective, and this breaks the text open. Well, that was text number 1. And now to text number 2, the second sin panorama in Romans. And we had this text read for our scripture reading, so I will not reread it. I will just headline it. The first part of the text says that out there in the world there is false thinking about God, that people are mixed up. There is no one who has understanding. There is no one who seeks God. The second part of the indictment says that out there in society there is debasement of language. Their throats are open graves. And you don't need to go to the first century to Paul's day to see that some of the biggest problems we have had in the world, some of the biggest things that happened in the 20th century, some of the worst things that are happening today, happen because people do what? We use language in a pretty bad way. We have fake news. We make up stuff. We do all kinds of things to tweak people's perception, using language, using rhetoric, using even manipulation to get people to see things a certain way. And from false thinking about God to debasement of language, we have a propensity for violence. We turn to violence to solve problems. And these are the elements of the sin panorama, or the human plight in Romans 3. So here is what I will claim on behalf of this text, the second sin text in Romans. The sins are these: false thinking about God, debasement of language, and resort to violence. In the context of Romans 3, these are societal sins, not individual sins. I have been teaching medical students at Loma Linda University, and I ask them when we read Romans 3, is this you? You know, false thinking about God, propensity to debasement of language, and resort to violence. Is that you? Well, if that is, these people are very nice people, and maybe that is human nature at rock bottom. But I think it fails. That text fails as a representation of individual sin, but it succeeds admirably as a representation of societal sin, the way the world works. So these are, and then a third point, these are sins we commit. They are also sins we commit when we aspire to make right what is wrong. The method we choose for remedying problems, and the method the world has chosen very often for making right what is wrong is what? Let's have another war. Let's have another war. Let's fix it by violent means. And here are my illustrations. Who committed this sin? Who committed this sin? Somebody else did it, right? I mean, do you consider that illustration I have there, do you consider that a sin? A big sin. But who committed it? There is a wonderful book about the creation of nuclear weapons called The World's Bomb, showing that who did it? A Hungarian scientist did it, a German scientist did it, a British scientist did it, some Japanese scientists did it, everybody did it. We were all in this together. It's the world's bomb. It is our project. And does Paul know about these sins that no one will really take ownership of, that no individual committed, but that the societies of which we are members, the countries of which we are citizens, we committed these kinds of atrocities, or this. And that is an illustration. We could maybe turn off the light up here, and then they might actually see my slides. We shouldn't do that. You can see it there. Anyway, who committed that sin? And here is a speech given during the First World War. A historian by the name of Philip Jenkins, has said that the most religious war ever fought in the history of humanity was the First World War. Now, you can see it better, can you? Is that okay? You don't need to see me. You need to see my illustration. So I think that is a good trade-off. So when people went to war, First World War, everybody knew that there would be war, but nobody knew why. And someone has written a book about that too, called The Sleepwalkers. You all know that there will be war. You all know that it is necessary to have a war, but nobody knows why it is necessary, because there is a kind of sort of momentum to this. And here is a speech given by the Bishop of London in the run-up to World War I. But when we have said all that, this is a holy war. We are on the side of Christianity against Antichrist. We are on the side of the New Testament, which respects the weak and honors treaties and dies for its friends, and looks upon war as a regrettable necessity. It is a holy war. A fight, and to fight in a holy war is an honor. But this is under indictment in Romans 3. This is a completely different logic. Kill Germans. This is a sermon given in Sunday church during World War I. Kill Germans, kill them, and so on. The same logic. So I have been doing a little of these exercises with students in Romans, and I have said that the faith language in Romans, Paul, we should think more not only of faith in Christ, but the faithfulness of God in Christ. Paul is really describing how God has intervened in the world, by what means God has intervened in the world. And the Bishop of London, I am sure he believes in justification by faith alone. But I am sure also that he has not understood the faithfulness of God in Christ, the way God makes things right in the world, and that in some ways we have read this text and its impact, it has not been felt on us. Okay, the third scene of sin is in Romans chapter 7. In some ways, that is probably the deepest excursion, or the deepest sort of digging deep into the subject of sin that you find in the New Testament and also in the book of Romans. So we have three sort of sin texts. We have Romans 1, we have Romans 3, and now we have Romans 7. And the text was read to us, so I will not repeat it here, and I urge you to study it on your own. I just want to bring a couple of new ideas to bear on how to read this text. Usually people think that when you read Romans 7, we are reading Paul's biography. The I in Romans 7 is the Apostle Paul, his spiritual awakening, his sort of introspecting and finding out all the garbage that he has inside him, and the sort of turning point of Paul coming to Christ. That way of reading Romans has been critiqued for 40, 50 years. You may not have heard it, but somebody wrote an article in the 1960s called Paul and the Introspective Conscience of the West, saying that we have read Paul completely wrong. Now, Christer Standal, who said that, did not consider the option that we have here in the text here, the comparison between Romans 7:11 and Genesis chapter 3, verse 13. In Romans 7:11, sin seized an opportunity in the commandment, deceived me, and through it killed me. The woman said to God that the serpent deceived me and I ate. So the deception language in Romans 7 and the deception language in Genesis 3 seem in some ways to feed off each other. And someone has written on this and said that in Romans 7, Paul uses the symbolic economies associated with Eve in the scene of the primeval transgression. Paul's allusion to the Genesis episode is subtle, but it permeates almost the entire chapter and suggests a complex interpretation of Eve's temptation to sin. So you could in some way say that in Romans 7, by this logic, it's not Paul's biography we hear. It is Eve's biography. And Eve's biography is our biography. So the biblical narrative now is sort of pressing to be recognized in Paul's letter to Romans. So just to corroborate that, and I'm almost done, there is a book called The Life of Adam and Eve, or The Apocalypse of Moses. It's an old text. It's not in the Bible. It is one of the apocryphal texts of one of the non-canonical apocalypses in print. It is as old as the letter to Romans. And from an Adventist point of view, it reads like the book Patriarchs and Prophets by Ellen G. White. You find an embellished story of how sin came into the world, the story of Adam and Eve. It's very interesting reading. And I am not making it up that it is similar to the book Patriarchs and Prophets. And I have a couple of quotations from it there, but I'm not reading them. I'm just moving on. So, can you see this? There is in Paul's representation of human plight, in Paul's representation of sin, a complexity to the argument, even as we look at Romans 1 by itself, that I think we have badly missed. And the way we exegete those passages may need to be reworked. But in the bigger scheme of things, there is a movement in Paul's preoccupation or Paul's interest in sin, Paul's interest in human plight. The perspective in Romans 1 is human and societal. The perspective in Romans 7 is cosmic and personal. The problem here is idolatry. The problem in Romans 7 is misperception of God. In Romans 1, humans are recalcitrant and depraved. In Romans 7, humans are needy and helpless. In Romans 1, the implied stance of God in Romans 1 is wrath. But the stance of God in Romans 7 is compassion. It is a kind of recognition that the human predicament is a predicament that must be faced with compassion from on high. In Romans 1, God's response is conceived in somewhat retributive terms, but in Romans 7, it's utterly on the remedial side of things. And the focus in Romans 1 are those terrible they people. They do this, they do that. You know, there is an emphasis on the third person, someone other than me. And in Romans 1, the problem The person who is in trouble is me. The wretched I is, in some ways it is also biographical, but Paul is not doing it primarily as autobiography. He seeks to engage and to put us into this story. And yes, you might say that this is sort of the, where the eyes drift toward his representation in Romans 7. That's where we might want to be going. So here is my summary, and sin 1 in Romans 1. How do I see, and now we are on the subject of diversity, what does this do for diversity? How does sin and diversity interact with each other? So in chapter 1, sin 1, how do I see the other? And implicitly, how do I see myself? And in Romans 3, sin number 2, what is my role in the sins we commit as citizens of the world, and as citizens of the various nations that we are citizens of? And sin 3, the story of sin. Listen to this. I need to get you to see that option at least. The story of sin does not begin with violation. It's not violation of the divine command that starts the sin story in Genesis. What is it that starts the sin story in Genesis? It is misrepresentation of the divine command. God, or the serpent saying, has God really said you shall not, and so on. So the sin story that begins with misrepresentation is the broader story. And the remedy there is the coming of Jesus Christ into the world to represent God to us, so that sin as misrepresentation can lose its hold on us.